For most of human history, the land stretching across West Texas and southeastern New Mexico was considered some of the least desirable real estate on the North American continent. No trees, barely any water, summers hot enough to kill you, and winters cold enough to finish the job. The Comanche controlled it, not because it was valuable, but because nobody else wanted it badly enough to fight for it. Spanish explorers passed through, noted that it was terrible, and kept moving. American settlers avoided it when they could, and yet, today, the Permian Basin produces more oil than most countries on Earth, and sits at the center of the global energy economy. So how did that happen? How did a patch of inhospitable desert accidentally become one of the most valuable pieces of land on the planet? The answer involves ancient oceans, failed ranchers, a drilling crew that almost gave up, and a revolution in technology that nobody saw coming. To understand why the Permian Basin is so valuable, you first have to go back about 250 million years, which is admittedly further back than most West Texans like to think. At that time, the region that is now West Texas sat at the bottom of a shallow inland sea. This sea was warm, full of marine life, and over millions of years the organic matter from that marine life accumulated on the seafloor and was buried under layer after layer of sediment. Heat and pressure did the rest, slowly cooking that organic material into hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas. The basin gets its name from this period, the Permian period, which ended with the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, wiping out roughly 90% of all species on the planet. The sea dried up, the land shifted, and what was left behind was a flat, arid, unremarkable landscape, sitting on top of one of the largest hydrocarbon deposits ever formed. For 250 million years, nobody knew it was there. For a long time after people did know, nobody could get to it. When American settlers began pushing into West Texas in the second half of the 19th century, they were not looking for oil. They were looking for land to ranch and farm, and they found that West Texas was extraordinarily difficult to do either. The terrain was harsh, water was scarce, and the Comanche, who had dominated the southern plains for over a century, were not interested in sharing. It wasn't until the Red River War of 1874 that the U.S. Army finally broke Comanche resistance, driving the last free bands onto reservations and opening the region to American settlement. What followed was a land rush, built almost entirely on optimism because the land itself offered very little encouragement. Ranchers moved in with longhorn cattle and discovered that droughts could wipe out an entire herd in a single season. Farmers arrived with dreams of crops and found that the soil and the rainfall had other plans. Towns sprung up along railroad lines, and many of them quietly disappeared within a decade. West Texas in the late 19th century was a place people passed through or endured rather than celebrated. The idea that this particular patch of desert was sitting on a fortune that would eventually reshape global geopolitics would have struck most of its early inhabitants as either hilarious or cruel. The first oil discoveries in Texas came in the east, not the west. Spindletop, near Beaumont in 1901, was the event that put Texas on the oil map and triggered the first great Texas oil boom. West Texas watched from a distance. There were rumors of oil out west, seeps in certain areas where petroleum bubbled naturally to the surface, and enough geological curiosity that some operators began drilling exploratory wells. Most of them found nothing. The rock formations in the Permian Basin were complex, and the oil sat trapped in tight, layered reservoirs that were difficult to locate and even more difficult to extract with the technology of the early 20th century. The first significant discovery in the Permian Basin came in 1921, near Ranger and the surrounding area, but the find that truly opened the basin came in 1923, when the Santa Rita No. 1 well came in on University of Texas land in Reagan County. The well was named after the patron saint of impossible causes, which, in retrospect, was either deeply ironic or remarkably prescient. That discovery triggered exploration across the basin, and within a few years it was clear that West Texas was sitting on something extraordinary. Midland and Odessa, two small railroad towns with little to distinguish them, suddenly found themselves at the center of one of the largest oil booms in American history. What followed was a transformation so rapid it barely seemed real. Roughnecks and wildcatters poured into the region. Derricks went up across the flat landscape. Towns that had struggled to survive became boom towns almost overnight. Midland developed into the white-collar hub where oil companies set up offices and executives built houses. Odessa became the blue-collar counterpart, where the workers lived and the equipment yards sprawled across the desert. The relationship between the two cities, 30 miles apart and economically intertwined, defined the character of the modern Permian Basin. Money flowed in, infrastructure was built, and West Texas underwent a reinvention so complete that the ranching and farming economy that had preceded it seemed like ancient history, even to people who had lived through it. By the 1950s, the Permian Basin was one of the most productive oil regions in the United States, and the cities it had created were prosperous, confident, and deeply tied to the fortunes of crude oil prices set half a world away. Which meant that when oil prices fell, West Texas fell with them. The boom and bust cycle became the defining rhythm of life in the Permian Basin, and it was brutal. The 1980s were particularly devastating. Oil prices collapsed, the regional economy cratered, and Midland and Odessa hemorrhaged population and businesses at a rate that recalled the failed towns of the 19th century. Banks failed. Houses were abandoned. The bumper sticker that circulated at the time said it plainly enough. "Please, God, let there be another boom, and I promise not to waste it this time." The Permian Basin had made people rich and then reminded them, repeatedly and without apology, that it could take everything back. By the early 2000s, large parts of the basin were considered played out. The easy oil had been found and extracted. What remained was locked in tight rock formations that conventional drilling could not reach economically. Many in the industry had quietly written off the Permian Basin as a spent force. They were spectacularly wrong. The technology that changed everything was hydraulic fracturing, better known as fracking, combined with horizontal drilling. The basic concept of fracking had existed for decades, but the combination of improved techniques, better equipment, and rising oil prices in the mid-2000s made it economically viable to apply it to the tight rock formations of the Permian Basin. What this meant in practical terms was extraordinary. Reservoirs that had been considered unreachable were suddenly accessible. Wells that would have been uneconomical became highly profitable. The Permian Basin, which the industry had been quietly retiring, erupted back to life with an intensity that surpassed even the original boom of the 1920s and 1930s. Production climbed year after year. New wells were drilled at a pace that strained the region's infrastructure and workforce. Midland and Odessa boomed again, this time with a scale and sophistication that the roughnecks of the 1920s could never have imagined. The numbers that emerged from this revival were difficult to comprehend. By the late 2000s, the Permian Basin was producing more oil per day than Iraq. By the early 2020s, it was producing more than any single OPEC nation other than Saudi Arabia. The region that Spanish explorers had dismissed, that American settlers had endured, that the oil industry had written off, was now producing roughly 5 million barrels of oil per day and sitting on reserves estimated in the tens of billions of barrels. The geopolitical implications were significant. American oil production, driven largely by the Permian Basin, fundamentally altered the global energy balance. OPEC's ability to control oil prices through production cuts was complicated by the fact that West Texas could ramp production up or down with a flexibility that traditional oil fields could not match. The land nobody wanted had become a strategic asset of the first order. So what do you make of a story like that? A shallow sea dies 250 million years ago and leaves behind a geological inheritance that humans wouldn't discover for nearly all of recorded history and couldn't fully exploit until the 21st century. Settlers arrived looking for grass and water and found neither in adequate supply. Oil men arrived looking for easy petroleum and found instead a puzzle that took a century to fully solve. The Permian Basin did not become valuable because anyone planned it that way. It became valuable because the geology was extraordinary, because the technology eventually caught up to what the geology required, and because the modern world runs on oil whether it wants to or not. West Texas, the place everyone overlooked, turned out to be holding the cards the whole time. It was just waiting for someone to figure out how to play them.